And we are first going to go back to the middle, sort of the end of last week's PowerPoint, because there's a couple of points that I need to emphasize or get to the end of here. All right, so let's get started with that. And let me check to make sure that you're seeing what I'm seeing. It looks like you are. Okay, somebody give me a hands up if you see implications of the Edgeworth box model in front of you. Thank you. Okay, great. That's what was not working this morning. So we're in much better shape. All right, so let me just reiterate where we were. We're working with the Edgeworth box model, the pure exchange model more specifically. And remember, we've got two individuals, Smith and Jones, and they've got an endowment. Smith has 10 oranges, Jones has 10 apples, and that puts them at this endowment point in the lower right-hand corner, E. We have indifference curves for each individual that passes through E, creating this lens. And the most important thing about this lens is that if Smith and Jones agree to an exchange of apples for oranges that moves them from point E into the lens, then we are assured that both Smith and Jones will become better off as a result of that trade. We could say, in other words, that there is gains from trade. Both of them will benefit or gain as a result of trading apples for oranges with each other. We can also say that surplus value is being created. And by that, it's just another word or phrase that's referring to the increase in utility or happiness that they get by virtue of trading with the other trading partner. Okay, and that surplus value is being distributed, if you will, between Smith and Jones. Smith is getting some of it, extra utility. Jones is getting some of it. But how that distribution occurs will depend on kind of where they end up in the lens. If they end up close to the red indifference curve of Smith, then Jones is getting a big bump up in utility, while Smith is just getting a small increase in utility. We could say the surplus is tilted in Jones's favor. He's getting more of the surplus value, Smith is getting less, and so forth. Now, what we'd like to do is to also be able to talk a little bit about where exactly they would end up trading to, because there's a lot of different points in that lens, and we didn't really give any indication about where they might ultimately end up. And so that's the object of the next part of the lecture. Economists like to come up with some sort of way of identifying the unique trading point, the point where they will sort of reach an equilibrium, where they will move to. But to do that, we need to add some additional kind of assumptions into the behavior of Smith and Jones. And that's what we're going to do next. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is to imagine that Smith and Jones are rational. And by that, I mean that they're going to use all the information they have available to them. And in this context, so far, we're assuming they have perfect information. So they have everything they need to know in order to make good decisions for themselves. And if they have that, we're going to imagine that they exhaust the gains from trade. Okay? And that means, and I'm going to identify this more carefully, that they're going to achieve what we call a Pareto Optimal outcome in economics. Okay? And the Pareto Optimal outcome, in general, just means that there's no ability for them to trade any further and to realize a greater increase in utility for both of them. Okay? They're stuck in a sense. They can't do any better than what they've currently achieved. And if they reach that outcome, we're calling that a Pareto Optimal. Let me give you a quick example. Go back to this diagram. If Smith and Jones were to trade from point E to point D, then we know that both of them get to a higher indifference curve because that's in the lens, but it's not going to exhaust the potential benefits that they can get. And we can see that by flipping back a few slides here to this one. And note that if they move from point E to D, they get to a higher indifference curve, but notice that at point D, there is still a lens here where they could trade further into, and again, both realize additional improvements in utility. So D is not optimal in that sense. It's not really achieving the ideal that that's possible before them. And so we want to zero in on where the points would be where they eliminate that potential for additional gains. And we'll make that point in just a second. Now, the other assumption here. We're going to also assume, furthermore, that Smith and Jones attempt to maximize their utility. Now, the way we do that, and this is going to be maximizing utility in the context of trading with the other individual. Now, the way we achieve the conditions for utility maximization is to actually do a mathematical exercise where we imagine that Smith and Jones have a utility function. We have them maximize that utility function subject to a trading constraint, and we derive what are utility maximizing conditions. All right, and those utility maximizing conditions I'm going to display to you. And I want to emphasize this is a little bit tricky and a little bit complicated. I'm not so critically interested in you remembering the details of this. It's coming from an exercise that we're not going to do in this class, and so it's going to automatically be somewhat confusing. But I just want you to kind of hear it and understand the gist of it. Don't worry too much if you're not understanding all of the details, because I'm not going to be testing you on this in any great detail whatsoever. And in fact, if I'm going to ask you anything, I'm more likely to ask you about Pareto optimality rather than the utility maximizing conditions. But I'm going to present both of them to you anyway. Okay, so let's go. Pareto Optimum. Pareto Optimum is defined as any point in the Edgeworth box such that there is no additional trade possible that can make both individuals better off. Okay, now how is that characterized? How can we visualize it? That comes down to the second point down here. Now, I've got some complicated formulas, looking formulas here. The left-hand side, just to describe them. Don't worry about, again, where they come from or where you would find these. You won't find these in our class, and you would need, like I said, a formula or an equation in order to calculate individual values like MUO. But what MUO refers to is the marginal utility of oranges. And you learned about marginal utility and what that means. It's the change in utility that comes from the consumption of an additional orange. MUA is the marginal utility, that is the additional utility that comes from an additional unit of apples consumed. And this could be at any particular point in the Edgeworth box for an individual. And it's kind of saying MUA would be, what is the additional utility if we bump up in this direction by 1 unit? And marginal utility of oranges would be, what would happen if we bumped up to the rightward direction by 1 unit? Now, we've got a ratio of marginal utilities here, which is going to be referred to as MRS, which stands for down here, the marginal rate of substitution. Again, don't worry about the terminology. Just recognize that, okay, you've heard this term and it came in this utility maximizing context. The marginal rate of substitution, though, corresponds to, and this is the critical point, is that it corresponds to the slope of an indifference curve. If we've got oranges and apples on the axis, and we've got a indifference curve, let's say looks something like that, if we picked a point on that curve, call it point B, and we determined what the slope of the tangent line is at point B, then the slope of that line is going to be equal to the marginal rate of substitution at point B. All right, so that's what it is. That's visually how we would find, or what we're defining when we have this term, marginal rate of substitution. If we picked another point on the same indifference curve here, call it point C, then notice that the slope would be a little bit different because the tangent C would be flatter because it's a curved line, and that would mean that the marginal rate of substitution would be a different value at that particular point. Now remember, there's lots of indifference curves. There's another one here, there's another one here, and there's different points on different indifference curves. All we're doing in calculating MRS is identifying what the slope of that indifference curve would be at each of those individual points. Okay, and that, if anything, is the relationship I want you to remember or recognize. MRS refers to the slope of an indifference curve. Now, Pareto optimality occurs when the slope of Smith's indifference curve, this value on the left-hand side, is equal to the slope of Jones's indifference curve, the value on the right-hand side, in an Edgeworth box diagram. Here's an example in this little diagram on the far right. Here we've got Smith's indifference curve, where Smith's preferences or indifference curves are rising in that direction. Jones's indifference curves are rising in this direction, and they are tangent or just touching each other at that particular point in the middle. All right, now, if we were to calculate the slope of the tangent line through that point where they're just touching, the slopes of Smith's indifference curve and Jones's indifference curve would be equal to each other. And thus, we would have what's called a Pareto optimal allocation. Let's see this in a little bit more detail. Here's our Smith and Jones diagram, 10 by 10 box. And notice that I have identified a bunch of tangencies between Smith and Jones's indifference curves. I got 5 indifference curves for each of them, and I have found 5 places where each indifference curve is tangent to the others, just touching each other. All right, now let me explain why that's Pareto optimal. And the best way to see that is to move away from that point, one of these points, to a point, let's say, like this one here. If we're at this point, notice that Jones and Smith's indifference curves don't just touch each other, they cross. And as a result of the fact that they cross each other, it creates this lens. And that means that they can always trade into the lens and make, again, both of them better off. And that's why we know that if I call this point Z here, Z is not a Pareto optimal point, because there are further gains from trade that they could realize by trading into the new lens that passes through point Z. All right, but suppose we move to a point here. Let me call that point Y. At point Y, well, we can't trade in any direction. We can't trade anywhere. Any direction we go, we could raise the utility of one person, but we're going to lower the utility of the other person at the time. And if we tried to move in this direction here, diagonally, then we're going to lower the utility of both of them by moving in that direction. So there's absolutely no way, once we're on that green line, to trade any further and improve the well-being of both of them simultaneously. That's the stopping point. That's the condition of Pareto optimality. Now, one other point I want to raise. I've identified the Pareto optimal points in the lens formed by the indifference curves through the original endowment for Smith and Jones. So these would be the Pareto optimal points that might be mutually beneficial for the two individuals, given the starting point. But these tangencies continue even beyond that particular point. It's going to go out to a point like this, and there's going to be another Jones indifference curve here, and another Smith one here, and there's going to be a tangency there. And these are going to extend all the way to the corner up here. And down here, they're going to extend all the way. So the Pareto optimal points actually stretch from the lower left part of the diagram to the upper right part of the diagram. They might squiggle around. It might be a straight line. It depends on the indifference curve structure of Smith and Jones that's going to determine that particular path, so to speak. But that defines the Pareto optimal points and the definition of the term. Any questions about that? Hang on. Michael, yes.
Yes, sir. I was just going to ask, for our purposes right now in the class, if we should assume, or at least expect, that the marginal utility at each level for each party will be the same when finding the Pareto optimal point.
Well, the marginal utility is a component of the marginal rate of substitution, and I don't know what the marginal utilities will be exactly. So no, that you can't really make that statement and be sure that that's going to be true. We only know that the ratios are going to be equal to each other when we're at the specified points. Okay, so but not the individual marginal utilities will necessarily be equal. Okay, I don't know if that question is kind of neither here nor there. It doesn't relate to, I think, anything that you're going to be faced with. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let me go forward. Now, for maximizing utility. Here we get to the following condition. If Smith and Jones were to do a maximizing exercise using mathematics, they would come up with the following condition. They would basically determine that in order to achieve an allocation of apples and oranges that maximizes their utility, they're going to find the following condition to be true. The left-hand side, you'll remember, is the price of oranges over the price of apples in dollar terms, but this is a terms of trade. And it's going to correspond to the slope of the line between the endowment point and the point to which they trade. So if point A here is the point to which they trade from their endowment at E, and this is Smith's indifference curve, then the slope of the line between A and E, rise over run, is going to give us the terms of trade, or the left-hand side of this particular expression. The right-hand side, we just defined previously in defining Pareto optimality. It's the marginal rate of substitution, MRS. Okay, and that's going to correspond to the slope of Smith's indifference curve at point A. Okay, and what we need to be maximizing utility is we need Smith to have a terms of trade, ultimately, that's exactly equal to the slope of his indifference curve at the point to which he trades, which is point A. And if he satisfies that condition, he's going to be happy that he's maximizing his utility given the circumstances. The same is true for Jones down here. Jones is also going to be maximizing his utility if he sets the terms of trade in an agreed upon trade with Smith, PO over PA, equal to the marginal rate of substitution, or the slope of his indifference curve at the point to which they trade, A. And then both of these have to be true simultaneously. Smith's got to be maximizing utility. Jones is maximizing utility at the same time and for the same shared terms of trade. Because when they trade with each other, the trading ratio, the terms of trade, has to be identical for both Smith and Jones because they're trading with each other. All right, now let's visualize that. Here's the visualization. The endowment is down here at point E, like it was before. S is a point in the lens, and it's a point on the Pareto optimal points connecting P and O here in the lens. Okay, but a further condition is satisfied, and that is if we take the slope of the black line, that's going to correspond to the terms of trade. But if we take the slope of the tangent line to Smith's indifference curve through point S, that also is going to correspond to the slope of the black line. So for Smith, the terms of trade is going to be equal to his marginal rate of substitution at point S. Call it point S. All right, but the same thing is going to be true for Jones. Jones is doing things upside down, but Jones's terms of trade is the same, given by the slope of the black line. And notice that the black line is also tangent to point S at exactly that same position. So for Jones, the terms of trade is also equal to his marginal rate of substitution at point S. And so we've got the conditions fulfilled for a utility maximizing outcome for the two individuals. The point of this is that if we can imagine that Smith and Jones are smart enough to figure out how to maximize their utility, they're going to be smart enough to find this, what will likely be a unique point in the lens. And that unique point then will be the point we think they could or should or would trade to in order to maximize their utility and thus guarantee that they get to a unique trading point in the lens. All right, now I want to show you why other points are not going to satisfy the condition. So let's say they chose another Pareto optimal point, O, to trade to. Okay, if they traded to point O, the terms of trade is going to be given by the slope of the line that's connecting the endowment point E to the point O. It's going to be what? 7 apples divided by 3 oranges. It's going to be 7 over 3. That will be the terms of trade from E to O. But look at what Jones's marginal rate of substitution is at point O. It's going to be equal to the slope of the tangent line through point O. The slope of this line, LOPE, is equal to the marginal rate of substitution for Jones at point O. And note that because that line is not the same slope as this line here, they're not equal to each other. The fact that they're not equal to each other means it doesn't satisfy the utility maximizing condition, and therefore Jones would not see that as an ideal point to trade to. He would reject it if that were the terms of trade that were offered to him, because it wouldn't maximize his utility at point O. Okay, but if we moved over to here, the same condition or situation like at O is likely to occur. In this modeling here, it's quite likely that there will be only one point S, which will satisfy both of these conditions simultaneously, and thus enables us to identify a unique outcome in the lens between Smith and Jones in their trading options. Okay, and so economists would then say, okay, as long as they're maximizing utility, they will reach a unique equilibrium outcome at point S, and that would be the point to which they trade. It does satisfy the condition that it's Pareto optimal. They've exhausted the gains from trade, and we can move on from there. Okay, so you've seen this. Again, at most, I might ask you one question about Pareto optimality and not much more. So I don't want you to dwell on this. I know it's complicated, and I want you to see it, but I don't want you to worry about not understanding it in its entirety, because, again, I'm not going to make it a big part of the rest of this analysis. With that said, are there any questions about it? Okay, ethics and trade. Let's get started. The first slide here is just emphasizing the fact that in order for Smith and Jones to be interested in trading at all, coming to the market and exchanging their apples for oranges or vice versa, self-interest is necessary. They have to be wanting to improve their utility in order to make trade a possibility. And so that's the first thing I just want to emphasize. Self-interested individuals motivates trade, and then trade itself actually assures that both of them can gain from trade. They both walk away happier by merely pursuing their self-interest. And that's an important thing to recognize. Trade is not something where one person gains, the other person loses. It's not like a competition or a basketball game where one person's going away the winner, the other is going away the loser. Instead, both are coming to this arena. They're trading with each other because they're interested in benefiting themselves. They're both interested in winning, and they both go home having won. And that's an important element about trade itself that you should recognize. Next, we talked about Smith and Jones maximizing utility a second ago. And I just want to emphasize the fact that if they trade to somewhere in the middle in these Pareto optimal points that are here, even to a point not quite at H, but at S, and notice this question comes up a lot, like why don't they trade automatically 1 for 1 and move to point H that looks like it's right in the middle, it looks like ideal. The reason is it could be point H, but it would likely only be H if, like, Smith and Jones had exactly identical preferences with each other, and if the Pareto optimal point happened to pass directly through there. It doesn't have to be exactly that way, though, because Smith might have a greater preference for oranges, and Jones might have a greater preference for apples, and that might skew their indifference curve somewhat so that the Pareto optimal point doesn't pass directly through that middle point. Maybe it passes from here like this, for example, because of skewed preferences and things like that. So there's nothing automatic about it having to be right in the middle like that. And you shouldn't focus on that particular outcome as necessarily likely. Could happen, but not necessarily. But we talk about moving to a point like S just a minute ago. S is in the lens, raises both utilities, and we talk about it as if Smith is maximizing his utility, right? But if we look at this diagram more fully and completely, we would notice that S is not really the best point that Smith could obtain if he had anything available to him. And in fact, the best point Smith could get is this point up here at point K. Because at point K, that would really maximize his utility, because that would be the point where he would have all the oranges and all of the apples. Can't do better than having everything, right? Same thing is true for Jones in reverse. Jones, if he had his druthers, he would like to be at point A down here, because at that point, Jones would have all the apples and all the oranges. And so we might ask the question, well, if they're maximizing their utility, why don't they actually achieve the best outcome for themselves? Well, there's an answer to that. First of all, movement from E, the endowment point, to a point like K does not involve trade. Trade is a quid pro quo. It's a I'll give you this if you give me that kind of arrangement. And when they move from E to K, if they were to move in that direction, then what would be happening is that Smith would be basically either taking away all of Jones's apples and acquiring them for himself, moving in this direction, I'm sorry, or Jones would be giving Smith all of his apples. All right, so that would not be a this for that kind of a trade. It would be just a transfer from one person to the other person. And in fact, any vertical movement, any horizontal movement, or any movement in this direction along the diagonal would correspond to either giving of goods or taking of goods, but not trading goods. So if the question is asking you about a trade between individuals, then you have to be talking about movements in this direction, upward or downward along the cross diagonal, and so forth. Okay, otherwise you don't have trade taking place. Now, we go back to Edgeworth, the originator of this Edgeworth box, or at least who got the name associated with the box. Francis Edgeworth was an economist, lived a long time ago. And he has this statement in his one of the books he wrote in 1881, Mathematical Psychics. And he said, the first principle of economics is that every agent is actuated, motivated, we might say, only by self-interest. Okay, I made that point just a minute ago. The workings of this principle, though, may be viewed under two aspects, according as the agent acts without or with the consent of others affected by his actions. He says, in a wide sense, the first species of action may be called war, and the second might be called contract. Now, what does he mean by that? By contract, he means an agreement. Smith and Jones can come to the market and agree to make an exchange with each other, to say, what, I'll give you 5 oranges if and only if you give me 5 apples, or some other arrangement that's mutually satisfying. Okay, and that's what he's referring to, contract, entering into a trade with each other. It's a collaborative or cooperative arrangement that requires some underlying assumptions that we're going to focus on in just a minute. War, however, is referring to the taking of goods by force or with superior power. Okay, so one option for Smith and Jones in the market, quote unquote, marketplace, is not to mutually voluntarily trade with each other, but to go battle it out, to fight for the goods that the other has come with, to try to hit the other one over the head or take advantage of them with more power or more strength and take all of the other person's goods away from them so that you can go home with everything. All right, now there's some risk in doing that, of course, because you might get injured in the process. But if you win the battle and if you're the stronger agent, then why should you contend with this mutually voluntary exchange when you can satisfy your maximization of utility in a much more direct way by just battling it out? Well, you could do that, but we are assuming that away in this particular market model. We're assuming that Smith and Jones agree not to do that with each other, not to battle it out, or not to engage in war, but to engage in mutually voluntary trade. Okay, so what I want to suggest here is that there's an implicit assumption about cooperation in trade. Okay, the pure exchange model assumes at the start that they're going to engage in contract and not in war. And that means the following, which is very, very important or critical. They accept property rights of the others. We're basically agreeing that Smith and Jones are going to come to the market with the following mindset. They're going to say, what's mine is mine. I possess it. It's my property. I own it. What's yours is yours. What you come to the market with is your possession, your property. I'm not allowed to just take it away from you. That would be a violation of property rights. Okay? And we can only exchange the goods with each other if it's mutually voluntary. If you agree to make the trade, then we can trade, but otherwise it's not acceptable behavior in the context of exchange or trade. So what we're basically saying in that process is saying we're assuming that individuals conform to the moral code of thou shalt not steal. I'm not going to try to use violence or force to try to take the goods away from the other person in order to maximize my utility in the fullest sense. Instead, I'm going to engage by these constraints on my behavior. I'm going to constrain myself not to steal things from you, but to only agree to make an exchange if it's mutually voluntary. I don't use force or coercion. I will not use violence to try to take goods away from you. I won't threaten you with, you could say, well, I didn't use force. I just threatened to hit you over the head with a club if you didn't give me all of your apples. Well, that's not allowed either. You're not allowed to do things that the other would not be willingly to engage in with you, okay, in order to take an advantage of them. And so the pure exchange model, and in fact, the entire model of economics throughout, is assuming that individuals adhere to these property rights agreements and that they're not going to all out battle each other in order to try to take goods away from each other. Okay, so that implicitly is in the background, and you should recognize that and incorporate it into the thinking about the model and how it works. If theft and violence did occur, what would happen? We could think about it. Suppose Smith and Jones have to travel to the marketplace in order to trade their goods with each other. And suppose on the way to the marketplace, it was quite likely that bandits would come along and take the goods that they were bringing to the market for trade. That might happen once or twice. You might try to prevent it. You might try to travel at night so the bandits don't catch you. But if that happens time and time again, the theft of your goods on your way to the market is going to discourage you from going to the market. If you went to the market each time and you were thrown into a ring to battle it out with somebody to try to gain all of the goods, and you lost all the time, well, guess what? You'd stop going to the market because it's not a real market. It's a contest. And what would happen if there were excessive violence, if there was excessive theft taking place in and around the marketplace, or is that it would prevent the market from occurring. And if the market doesn't occur, there's no trade. And if there's no trade, there's no mutual benefit. The gains from trade are lost because you don't have the opportunity to mix up your goods and get a different basket than the one that you came to the market with. Okay, and so what would happen if people did not adhere to this moral principle is that markets would not function hardly at all and maybe not at all, and we would not get the benefits from trade that are being described here. Okay, any questions on that particular point? One way of saying this, I want to just emphasize, one way of saying this is that we're assuming that self-interest is constrained. You can't fulfill your self-interest any old way you want. You have to constrain it by saying, I'm going to agree also not to engage in violence or theft or coercion in order to acquire other goods at the marketplace. Okay, so self-interest must be constrained in order for economic markets to work. And that's an important point we're raising here. Now, there's another assumption we're making in the model that is also hidden in the background, but I want to bring it out and make it explicit. We make the assumption of perfect information. And this is actually a pretty strong assumption because, if you even think about your day-to-day lives and think about what you have information about things at the marketplace, what you know perfectly, you don't really have perfect information. You need to acquire information about the goods you're buying. Think about going on Amazon and shopping for something. You don't just say, oh, I need a bar of soap. Oh, here's soap, I'll buy it. No, you want to find details about it. You want to find out what the smell is. You want to find out how big it is. You want to find out what the price is. You need to gather information in order to make decisions about what to buy and what satisfies your preferences. And then also, you don't really have perfect information about your preferences all the time either, like we're assuming here. You don't necessarily know all of your likes and dislikes across the universe of goods and services that you might potentially consume. You know about the things you buy regularly, but you don't know about things you've never purchased before. And so we don't really have perfect information about our preferences or about the quality of the goods that we're buying. All right, well, we can ask, what would happen? What happens if we relax this assumption of perfect information? Well, imperfect knowledge, this third bullet point, opens up the door for agents to deceive each other. All right, they can trick each other by basically saying, "Hey, I've got really great goods. You're going to love them. When you buy them, take them home. You'll be happy. But maybe when you take them home, you're going to discover that the food product is rotten, that they're spoiled, or you're going to find that the quality of the goods you purchased are not as good as you expected or hoped, and you might be deceived in some particular way about the objects or the goods you're buying." It might be that individual traders embellish the qualities, maybe untruthfully. You make up a phrase like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Hey, eat apples, you're going to be healthy. You've got arthritis, you've got a bad back. Well, apples are a great way to relieve that. Just eat an apple every day and you're going to be happy. Maybe that's not true. Really hard to tell whether it's true or not. But it's like trading or providing false information to try to embellish the qualities of your goods to hopefully get a higher price for it and to trade and make yourself better off as well. Now, in our model, we assume that problem away. We assume that individuals cannot deceive each other if we assume perfect information about the products you're purchasing. Perfect information means you already know when you're trading exactly what you're going to get. And you can factor that into your utility function, decide whether that bundle is going to be better for you or not, and by how much, and you make appropriate decisions that guarantee that if you voluntarily enter into a trade, it's going to raise your utility. But if you voluntarily enter into a trade and you're not sure about the goods you're going to get, then it might not live up to your expectations. And you might, not automatically, but you might actually you will end up with lower utility than you expected, and maybe even lower than when you came to the marketplace in the first place. Okay, so when expectations are not fulfilled, when you're deceived or misinformed in some way. Maybe you're not deceived, but you just weren't given the information you needed in order to make the appropriate decision. Well, when you're not fully informed, your utility increase is going to be less than what you might have expected it to be. All right, and that means you have the potential that deception might actually certainly reduce your utility relative to expectations, but it might even reduce your utility so much that you wish you hadn't traded at all. All of us have had that kind of outcome happen. You've bought something at the store, you've taken it home, you've realized, oh, this is garbage, this is junk, I don't know if I can return it. I bought it from somebody at a street market and now I don't know where to find them again and I can't take it back and now I'm stuck with it. You realize, I wish I hadn't made that particular trade. Or you go into a movie. You go to a movie, you've heard great things about it, you think it's going to be wonderful. You sit through 15 minutes of the movie and you go, this is the worst movie I've ever seen. I wish I hadn't spent the money to go in and see it. All right? Those are cases where you actually lose from trade. But it's important to recognize that you lose because you didn't have the right information. You didn't have perfect information about what to expect, and that's where the loss came about because of. Right? So imperfect information is a necessity to guarantee that trade is mutually beneficial. If you don't have perfect information, it doesn't automatically imply that trade is not beneficial, but it probably implies that trade is not going to give you as big a bump up in utility as you originally expected, and quite possibly deception could actually lead you worse off than if you hadn't traded at all. Okay, so in order to guarantee this win-win outcome, we assume away the possibility of deception. We assume away this bad behavior on the part of agents in order to guarantee that we indeed get a good result for the two individuals. Now, any questions on any of that? Okay, so let me just summarize. We make an assumption in the model that trade is mutually voluntary. That assumption corresponds to some ethical constraints. And in particular, it corresponds to accepting property rights is one way to say it. It corresponds to the idea that you're willing not to steal from each other or engage in theft, that you're not going to use force or coercion or threats of force. You're not going to inflict injury on other people in order to intimidate them and get better terms of trade. And kind of importantly at the end here, you're actually giving people in this model the freedom to engage in trade if they want or not engage in trade if they don't want. I mean, all of us are allowed to walk into a store, for example, walk around, look at the items, and then walk out without trading. Nobody is forcing us to make an exchange. And we're given that freedom to satisfy our desires or not through trade by making trade voluntary. So mutually voluntary trade is incorporating all of these ethical sort of principles as necessary in order to assure that trade is going to be win-win for both agents involved. Likewise, the assumption of perfect information, the ethical equivalent of that is that agents are not lying or deceiving each other, that they're representing their products accurately. And you know, a lot of times, problems occur over time. Trade occurs over time. So one of the big problems with trade is a lot of times you're going to make a trade and say, tell you what, I'm going to give you so much money if you give me so much in goods. But I'll give you the money later, or I'll give you the money later, you give me the goods now. The trades are not necessarily taking place at exactly the same time. Think about a loan. I agree to lend you $100 if you promise to pay me back $100 plus interest a year from now. All right, that is a trade that's taking place over time. And I have to hope and believe that you're going to fulfill your promise to me to actually give me my money back plus the interest in order for that trade to be mutually beneficial for the two of us. Because if you don't live up to your promise, if you don't pay me back, then I'm out my money and I'm not getting my interest payment in return in the future, and I'm going to end up losing as a result of that transaction. So, in order for markets to work well, we need individuals to fulfill these ethical principles at the same time. It's an important component of the market system. What have I got here? Okay, two people pursuing their individual self-interest, trade X for Y, any X for Y. And if it's mutually voluntary and with perfect information, then we can guarantee from those assumptions that both traders are benefiting from trade. Trade is win-win. And then I mentioned this last time in class. We should look around us and recognize that transactions are taking place, trades occurring all the time. There are billions and billions of transactions, trades that are taking place, one item for another item, between two individuals. A lot of those are taking place with good information, maybe not perfect, but good enough to make the trade and to do it again and again and again. The conditions above are satisfied for the most part, not always. There are exceptions. And when they're satisfied, we can be assured that every one of those trades is actually creating surplus value, increases in utility on both sides of that transaction. And that's what's remarkable about trade. And that's true about trading between you and the merchant down the street, and it's true about trading when you import a good from the rest of the world. Both sides are benefiting, again, as long as the basic assumptions of the model are fulfilled for the most part. Self-interest with ethical constraints implies the beneficial outcomes for everyone. Business profit, then, when businesses make money under these constraints, that profit is a good measure of the benefits that are actually being produced for other people. In this context, then, and under these assumptions, profits are good, and it means that those businesses are doing well by society. They're actually fulfilling, not just satisfying their own self-interest, but they're also satisfying the interests of their customers who are benefiting from the products that the businesses are producing. And good businesses that are reliable, that we go back to over and over again, those are good examples of businesses that are benefiting from trade. If you have self-interest without ethical behavior, it's not automatic, but it's more likely to be a win-lose outcome. And I would tend to refer to these types of situations as self-interest that's motivated by greed. Greed is really excessive self-interest, and greed is mostly epitomized. And I've got a reference here to a TV show called American Greed, where almost all of those episodes correspond to somebody in the marketplace who is either trying to steal from somebody else, they're trying to swindle them, they're con artists, they're using trickery of some sort, and they're trying to benefit themselves not by benefiting others at the same time, but by harming others at the same time, by violating the ethical principles. And that's a good way of thinking about how and what greed represents in the marketplace. Now, just real quickly, are ethical assumptions satisfied in the real world? I mean, I would argue that yes, most of the time we are making trades that we make over and over again. When you purchase your cell phone plan or your cell phone, when you purchase the rent for your house, when you buy food at the store and you go back to that store again and again and again, most of the trades you're making, you come home with products that you're happy to have paid the money for and you're benefiting from those particular transactions. You're winning, the merchants are winning, maybe 70, 80, 90%, maybe 95% of the time, the trades you're making with other individuals actually generate an improvement in your well-being, and that's likely to be true on the other side as well. So most trades in the world today are actually win-win, although there are plenty of examples we can think of, and we probably remember the examples where we lost more often than we remember the examples where we win. Now, I want to emphasize that there are mechanisms that are in place to enforce these rules of the game. And we shouldn't, we should recognize those are there entirely because good behavior generates good outcomes. There are private mechanisms and public mechanisms. Private means things you do on your own without the use of government. So fences, walls, locks, safes. Religion is a good way to inspire individuals to be good to each other, to not be violent, to not cheat, to fulfill your promises, and so forth. That is not a government subscribed process. It is a private process that people ascribe to, and then it helps them engage in trade in a more reliable way, presumably, because you've got that private mechanism to assure or try to promote good behavior. We've got private schools and family and community pressures that all come to bear to try to push people to behave in an appropriate way, to behave morally or ethically. But we also have public mechanisms, right? We have local police and we have the military to prevent foreigners from invading our country and taking our goods away from us and our freedoms. We have a judicial system in place with laws against theft and violence and deception and so forth, and mechanisms to point the finger at violators of these principles and to punish violators of these particular principles. So not going into too much detail, but just recognize that we have public and private ways of trying to force people to conform to these principles. Now, enforcing the rules in international trade. Trade requires mechanisms to assure payments are made and goods are received. Think about international trade now. And think about the problems that are going to arise very quickly if you're thinking about shipping your goods to somebody in another country. The first thing that might arise is, you agree with, let's say you agree, you're an importing company and you're going to buy wine from a French merchant who's selling wine. You say, tell you what, ship your wine over to me, and as soon as I get the wine, I'll send payment to you. To which the foreign merchant might say, well, wait a minute, how do I know that I'm going to get the payment once the goods are received? I don't want to send you the goods until I get the payment. So the French merchant might say, tell you what, you send me the payment and then I'll ship the goods over to you, and in 2 months they're going to be arriving at your place. To which the person on this side of the trade would go, well, wait a minute, how do I know if I send you the money, you're actually going to send me the goods? Okay, so this is a typical problem of trust. How can you trust the person that you're trading with is actually going to live up to their end of the bargain? I'll give you a couple of quick mechanisms, and I just want to highlight that these are out there, and this is an important element of international trade. Okay, one way you can do this is not typical now, but one way you could do is to create like a bonded warehouse. And this is generally used to fulfill customs duty payments are made. But think about it this way. Suppose you engage in trade with a foreign merchant and say, okay, I'm going to import wine from you. Tell you what, you ship the wine over to me, and the wine is going to come into the port and be put into a bonded warehouse, a warehouse that's sealed up and confined. And the person buying the wine can't get it out of the bonded warehouse, which is managed by an intermediary firm, okay, somebody independent of the two. They're going to have this warehouse and say, you can bring your goods, put them into the warehouse, and then we won't release it to the person who's buying it until you give us the assurance that the payment has actually been made. So it goes into this warehouse, it gets sequestered, held in place, and only after the payment is actually made to the foreign merchant does the warehouse release the product to the person who's buying it. And that's a simple mechanism that could be used to try to assure that the goods are received and the payment is made and both sides can live up to their end of the deal. I give you a reference here to what are called import letters of credit. And this is ways of financing international trade that are also seeking to solve exactly the same problem. How do we make sure that the person is going to deliver the goods that they promised to deliver, and that the person buying the goods is actually going to make payment for the goods to the other person? Because these two transactions don't take place simultaneously and in person together at the same time, you need to come up with some mechanism to assure that these two sides of the trade are indeed fulfilled. And these kinds of mechanisms have become really important ways that have allowed us to extend trade beyond our local community and to be actually able to trade internationally with people around the world. Okay, this is solving the problem associated with dishonesty and unethical behavior that might occur with people, especially that we don't know. We don't know personally, and we can't be sure we can trust them. Okay, any questions? Yes. Shayna.
In what format are the large payments usually made, between governments?
In what format are they made? What do you mean?
How do they do the transfer of money? Is it instantaneous or?
I am not an international goods trader, so I don't have information about exactly how those transactions. But I mean, today, wire transfers of money, electronic payments are made. It's much easier to do than, say 100 or 150 years ago when you didn't have those electronic payments that could be made. But it's going to be made generally through an intermediary like a bank. So the payments would go to a bank. The bank would say, oh, they've got the money to make this payment. We're going to put it into your account when it gets in. So it's all going to be done kind of through an intermediate financial institution that's going to facilitate those exchanges of currency and trades of money. But the details of that, I'm not entirely sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, one bit of terminology real quick here is a little bit later in the course, in a few more weeks or about a month or so, we're going to be talking about something called market imperfections. And market imperfections are situations where the market is not perfectly competitive, essentially. Well, one of the assumptions of perfect competition in a market is that these ethical principles are being fulfilled. So if they're not fulfilled, if people are stealing from each other or if people are deceiving each other in the goods that they're trading, we can classify that as a type of market imperfection. Institutions like the public and private mechanisms that I just highlighted previously are incorporated in order to try to correct or eliminate some of these market imperfections. Okay, so public mechanisms like government help solve these problems. Doesn't necessarily solve them perfectly, but it helps reduce the incidence of disruptions that can occur when people are behaving unethically. And other private mechanisms like religion also help solve these, not perfectly again, but it helps mitigate, reduce the incidence of these particular situations and tries to make, or at least will have the effect of making markets work more effectively, generating more welfare improvements for the people who are participating in the markets themselves. All right, and so we can think about that as a way, as kind of why these institutions are there and what they're there to do, what they're trying to solve. And again, in economics terminology, we would say they're trying to solve for the problem associated with the market imperfection of unethical behavior in this case. Okay, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. Now, I've got a few more minutes, 10 minutes or so. I want to talk real quickly about the process of intermediaries. An intermediary here is a person or business that helps facilitate trade by reducing transactions costs. Okay, I just talked a little bit a minute ago or so about bonded warehouses, and that's an example of a firm that might come into being just to help facilitate the transactions in the trade between a foreign merchant and a domestic merchant that are trying to trade goods for money and try to make that a profitable endeavor. Okay, well, intermediaries are there to try to eliminate some of these transactions costs, the threat or the problem associated with deception or a non-fulfillment of promises, for example. Now, in order for that to arise, there has to be imperfect information, okay? And there is. I mean, the real is rampant with information, imperfect information, okay? And so in telling this story about intermediaries, we are indeed relaxing that particular assumption. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now, suppose Smith and Jones want to trade with more people, or let's say they want to trade with each other, but they don't know how to find each other. You know, Smith has oranges and he would love to trade them for apples, and Jones has apples and he would love them to trade them for oranges, but he doesn't know where Smith is, and Smith doesn't know where Jones is, and they don't know how to find each other in order to engage in trade. So suppose a third person, we're going to call them an intermediary, creates a business because they know how to find Smith and Jones and how to match them up with each other to allow them to engage in trade. Okay, so let's think about how that would work and how we can use this Edgeworth box model to illustrate it. Now, in an international context, these businesses are import and export firms. Okay, we've got firms that do nothing more than kind of find products abroad, bring them to the country, and then find people who are willing to put them up for sale at retail establishments and sell them. And so there's lots of firms that are just engaged in the middle of the transaction. And they're the go-between. They're trying to facilitate this process of matching buyers with sellers and so forth. All right, so let's imagine a simple story. The importer finds businesses making a product abroad. For example, let's say coffee growers in Colombia. All right, and so what has to happen is we've got a lot of small farmers in Colombia and in South America that are in rural areas, mountainous areas, and they've got a small farm or an acreages of land, and they've got coffee plants planted there, and they're harvesting coffee beans. Well, who are they going to sell it to? Well, somebody's going to come into that area and say, oh, there's a whole bunch of people around here harvesting coffee. We're going to buy it up, and we're going to then transport it to the ports, and we're going to transport it abroad to the US and Europe, and we're going to find like coffee roasting firms somewhere else, and we're going to sell those beans to them. Okay, so you need somebody that's going to actually facilitate that transportation of the product from the source country to the place where it's demanded. Okay, but in exchange for those particular services, the intermediary firm is of course going to charge a fee because it costs them something to engage in all of these transactions, to find the sellers, to accumulate all the coffee, to transport it, to move it to where the coffee roasting firms are, who are ultimately going to roast the coffee and put it into retail sales and sell it to the final consumer. If there was perfect information, the coffee bean grower would be able to match directly with the roasting firm and sell directly to them because they would know where they are and know what's available to them. But oftentimes, it's not that easy to have that information at your fingertips. Okay, so suppose Sam and John are at an endowment point A. Okay, so this is back to Sam and John with butter and bread. This is one of the examples in the practice problems. Okay, so John has, let's see, 16 loaves of bread. That's 16 there, following the scale. Sam has 12 sticks of butter. Okay, right here. Okay, and they're at the endowment point A. Now suppose, now these two might, with perfect information, trade to a point like right here in the middle, F. But suppose John doesn't know where Sam is, and Sam doesn't know where John is, and they can't meet with each other to trade. But an intermediary, IMD for short, finds John first and says, tell you what, John, I'm going to trade with you. You've got 16 loaves of bread. I'm going to trade with you to point E. Okay? At point E, the intermediary is going to give John 5 sticks of butter in exchange for 8 loaves of bread. Now, first of all, we might ask, well, where does the intermediary get the 5 sticks of butter? Let's say he does the following. He tells John, you can trust me. Tell you what, you give me the 8 loaves of bread, and I'm going to pay you the 5 sticks of butter tomorrow. Okay? And then you're going to be, we'll have engaged in that particular trade to point E. Now notice, at point E, John is on a higher indifference curve than he would be at point A. So John's utility is indeed rising up and moving to point A. John might go, great, I'm able to make a trade. This is a better deal for me than I had before. He engages with the intermediary. Now the intermediary turns around and goes to Sam, who he also knows about, and he tells Sam, tell you what, I'm going to trade with you from point A, which is where Sam is, and I'm going to trade with you to point G. Okay, but in trading to point G, he's going to give 6 loaves of bread, and notice that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right up to here, and he's going to exchange it for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sticks of butter. All right, so he goes. Now, where does he get the 6 loaves of bread that he's going to give? Well, he got them from John in the previous trade, and he's going to give him the 6 loaves of bread, but he's going to hold on to the 2 extra. And he's going to trade him for 7 sticks of butter. Now, those 7 sticks of butter are going to move Sam to point G, and notice that Sam moves to a higher indifference curve in moving from A to point G. So Sam is happy by that trade as well. He's getting increased surplus, he's getting higher utility. Now, the intermediary takes the 7 sticks, and now he's got to go back and pay the 5 sticks back to John. All right, and he gives 5 sticks to him. Now, what happens in the end? Sam moves from point A to point G. John moves from point A to point whatever that is. I have lost it because I've drawn too much on the graph. Moves to point E. And the intermediary ends up acquiring this box, namely 2 sticks of butter and 2 loaves of bread. So the intermediary receives a fee in exchange for the services that he's providing in matching up John and Sam. Now, the last bullet point here is that the intermediary must start with some capital, some butter sticks or some money, or he has to borrow it from some way and promise to pay back later in order to make this exchange. So the intermediary has to have some ability to kind of engage at different times with these different individuals in order to incur and to make this process possible. Now, how much do they end up with at the end? The answer is 2 sticks and 2 loaves. Is the intermediary better off after all of this? Well, the answer is going to depend on the cost of providing the services. If 2 sticks of bread and 2 loaves of bread and 2 sticks of butter is enough to cover the costs of the intermediary finding John and Sam and engaging and moving the products, then it's going to be profitable for the intermediary to do that. And if the intermediary can do this not just with John and Sam, but with lots of individuals, he's going to be able to lower the price he charges for each of them to a very small amount, and he's going to add that up across lots of individuals to cover his costs of providing this intermediary service. Okay, and so that's how intermediaries work. And notice then, what's kind of happening here is that there's a lot of surplus to be gained by trading butter and bread between Sam and John here. These are the original indifference curves, and they can move to a much higher level of utility for both of them. There's surplus value to go around. By engaging with the intermediary, John gets a little bit less than he might get ideally with perfect information. Sam gets a little bit less than he might under the conditions of perfect information. And the intermediary is grabbing some of that surplus as well. He's getting some benefits from the trading as well because he's facilitating the trade taking place. Okay, and so this is a win-win-win-win situation. Win-win-win. All three parties benefit as a result of this particular trade. Okay, all parties benefit from this particular outcome. Now, the last slide, I got 2 minutes. Consider coffee intermediaries really quickly. Okay, an intermediary is somebody who goes to the poor, usually poor coffee growers in developing economies like in South America, and they pay the coffee farmers for their coffee beans. All right, but what they can do is they can often charge a very low price for the coffee they're buying. They could say just enough to kind of keep the coffee growers going, and they could, in essence, back to here, if John is the coffee grower, for example, they could trade with John to a point like this, okay, where John doesn't get very much surplus from the trade, but he gets some surplus. And being a poor coffee grower in a developing country, you might not know about what the proper price should be for your coffee. You might not know how much the intermediary is going to make. You might not know what the market price is abroad. You might not have an option to trade with other intermediaries in the area because only one comes to your mountain town and purchases the product from you. So you're sort of stuck buying from the intermediary that comes and knocks on your door. The intermediary then can move that product to the developed economy and sell it to coffee roasters and sell it for a much, much higher price because they know that the consumers are willing to pay a much higher price for coffee there. And as a result, the intermediary can grab on to a huge amount of the surplus that's available between the buyers and sellers of coffee, the sellers in the developing economy of the beans, and the buyers of coffee being the final consumer in the developed market. One last point. Fair trade coffee, really quickly, sort of corresponds to this situation that I'm describing. And it's trying to solve the problem of how do we get better prices to be available to the poor coffee growers in developing economies. Okay, and what fair trade coffee does is they basically get intermediaries to kind of agree to offer the coffee farmers a much higher price than they could get away with, to give them greater surplus value than otherwise. And then they tell the consumers in the developed countries that you're engaging in trade in a way that's assuring that they get a much higher price for this. And that's what fair trade coffee is trying, the problem they're trying to solve, essentially. Now, I would just point out one last thing, is that the market solution to this particular problem, and the problem is really arising because there's not enough competition amongst the intermediaries. If there's not enough competition for intermediaries, then one intermediary can kind of grab the market and get what we would call monopoly prices for the product and grab onto a lot of the surplus. Competition would eliminate a lot of that surplus and make trade more viable. Okay, I've gone beyond my time. I will stop now. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to stick around. Otherwise, have a great day, and I'll send out an email to all of you with some more instructions about the quiz and to make sure you're ready for that.
Thank you.